Good. How you doing?
They didn't have any. They had the heavy duty programs and you just in the bleachers, you saw all these programs like this, like
Yeah, you
bars
go
of bleeding at night
giant
under
huge
water.
fan and
Just like,
everything.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yay!
Quite warm, supposed to cool off tomorrow.
yeah,
Yeah, it's just
I can't imagine.
to have a two-story house with no AC.
Right, right. In the heat, yeah. In the summer.
Oh, I guess I can just.
Yeah.
And for 3 days that we use. And then you can.
Right.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Short.
See, for us, for me, once it hits like 90, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm definitely turning it on, or 80, high 80s, 90s. 3 days.
Okay. Good evening. Good evening. This is, I'm calling meeting to order. This is our second of 3 work sessions addressing our budget for the 18-19 school year. And also we are going to discuss the non-representative administrator compensation study tonight. And let's turn it over to Mr. Ben Rarick.
Thank you, Ben. Showing up right? Perfect.
You'll receive printed copies in just a few minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Sir, have my original copy she took off.
She's
Had
got
some
it with
notes
her
on it,
here.
but- All right, well. Maybe I can. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So this is the second of a 3-part series. Remember last time we went into some depth on the revenue projection, both in aggregate and by program. Today, what I was hoping to do is get a little bit into the expenditure side of the budget. We also took very close notes in terms of all the questions you have. We have some of those answers, but we don't have all of them tonight. So just to know that we are plugging along on those and probably give you something comprehensively at some point. So what we have today, just before we get into it, is we do have MSOC data for you. We have staffing data for you. We don't have compensation for you yet, just where we're at in the process. So we don't have aggregate lump sum totals because that's obviously a third main ingredient to that. But by the time we're done tonight, you'll get a really close sense of it. Obviously, when you know the staffing and the MSOC, you pretty well know what the house is going to look like, as it were. Okay, so we'll briefly review the revenue outlook. Take a look at the expenditure outlook for 18-19. I've got some slides on proposed MSOC. This is our non-salary accounts. Some slides on the classified and certified staffing, what that's looking like, both from our basic ed side and some of our categorical programs. I have slides for each of the other funds. So we have 4 other funds other than the general fund that you all have responsibility for, obviously. We'll walk through those. There's actually a couple of important issues in, at a minimum, the debt service and capital projects fund. So we'll want to spend a few moments on that. And then we do have some slides for you on the latest, our best guess of where we will land this year. The question was asked last time we were here. So we didn't, you typically get that 20-slide presentation. I think we took 3 of those for you tonight, just so you have that.
So, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
So I believe that
Oh, that should
that
have
whole
18.
point should be 2018.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
So strike 19, put 18.
2018,
Okay.
on the second slide.
Okay. So just to review, you saw this data in much greater detail the last time we met, but this is how it represents an aggregate. Will be roughly at about $400 million. And that, of course, represents an increase in our state funding and a decrease in our local funding. The increase in the state funding happens immediately next year. The decrease in the local funding takes a little time, but part of it is indeed reflected for the 18-19 school year. Okay? Now, I think one or two of you have seen this slide, but anytime we start talking about a budget, a good place to start is enrollment. I think Maya was the one that found this slide particularly useful, so I thought I'd take a moment to go over it. A lot of data, but don't let it be overwhelming. There's really just 3 columns you want to pay attention to, okay? The yellow side is what we have historically projected in the budget, okay? The blue is what has actually materialized over the last 7 years, okay? And then what is that, I guess it's a green. On the right is the variance, okay? Couple things I want to point out. Let's first start with, I think, which is a very significant piece of good news and something I wanted to say in Lisa's presence. You see the box down to the bottom right that says 0.12%. That is the closest that the Kent School District has projected enrollment since in the last 7 years. And it's an astoundingly accurate prediction. I'd like to take credit for it, but I have nothing to do with it. But for all of the community talk about enrollment, I would like people to know that this was an incredibly accurate year. There were some, Running Start and a couple of other, the non-generals continue to grow beyond what we thought they would, but just on the K-12 general population, I would be thrilled if we were that accurate every year. We probably won't be, frankly, because that really is hitting about 400. But it's great news, and I hope it is shared. And then another thing I wanted to point out, we'll go over to the yellow on your far left. Okay, the other box. 411 students over 6 years. So there's been a lot of talk about growth in Kent, and there's been a lot of talk about projecting growth. And the real story is that we've really been remarkably flat over the last 7 years. So you go back to 2011-12 and fast forward to 2018-19. Oh, good. You know, my copy had a couple of notes on it. Did you have mine? Okay, good. So the growth from 11-12 to 18-19 has just not been all that significant. 411 students over 6 years compared to some of our Puget Sound peers is just not a lot of growth. Right. So you'll see in 18-19 that we have very modest enrollment projections. In part because, let's go back over to the green. Remember we were talking about the great year that we just had? Look at all the 7 numbers that precede it. Right. Every single year, even when we've been close, we've been a little over. Meaning we've budgeted for slightly more, or sometimes quite a bit more than what materialized. So, as I've shared with, I've had some conversations with colleagues in other districts, and what I've learned is it's not uncommon to be off in your enrollment, but it is uncommon to be off on one side every year. And so that's part of the reason for the very modest projection. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay. Okay, so I have this slide and this slide. One is classified and one is certified. Okay. And this is, I've marked these preliminary because there might be a couple very small changes. This is the data I have at this moment. Okay. So let's start with classified. All right. So we're looking at, in aggregate, an increase of about 11 FTE from last year, but there's puts and takes throughout the data, right? So that's why you have the bars. So in inclusive ed, you're talking about close to an 11% increase. Okay, in district-wide support, which is a lot of admin, you're looking at a decrease. So it's an increase, but not a uniformly applied increase. That makes sense? Okay.
Yeah, kind of baseline for that budgeted versus actual FTE. So budget FTE is how many people we would like to have full on. We get everybody here all 9 months. But we're looking at 17, 18. Is that the same number, or is it the actual people we've had?
I've got the actual number for you if you want it. It was on there and then we took it off. But, can I come back to that question while
Yeah,
my
sure.
computer kind of warms up? You have that handy, Lisa. I wrote it.
And so the last year budgeted is last year full budgeted, assuming everybody's on?
Yep.
Okay.
There we go. So actual. A little fancy footwork here, just give me just a second. So what I have down was from actual of the last payroll. And that number is, May actual was 1,038. So that's not positions, that's people in
Right,
the
it's
position,
people,
right?
yeah.
That's warm bodies in the, okay?
Question, maybe we're getting to that.
Mhm.
Out of this district-wide support,
Yes.
what percentage is classified versus certificated?
Okay, so everything that you see on this slide is classified.
Right, but what is the percentage? When we say there's a 6% decrease,
Uh-huh.
let me think what I'm asking here.
So that-
So I'm jumping to the next slide.
Okay.
To the certificated staff. So there, it's not showing district support decrease, but we do have certificated staff in district, under district-wide support.
Let me take a look.
I don't know if you follow my question. So when we say 6% decrease
Yes.
under classified.
Yeah.
But we don't show the certificated, but what is the decrease there
Yeah, okay.
for district-wide support?
All right, I think I'm following you, so let me take a shot at that.
Okay.
So my data say, and are you, so we're on, let's go to that one then, okay? What I have is, I have only 6.1 certificated staff in the district-wide support cost center.
Okay,
So it's the far right of the slide number
okay,
6.
all right. So that
Okay?
has
It's
gone down.
It's a very small part of that budget.
Okay.
It's an increase, but that can mean a lot of different things with a number that small.
Okay.
It could be, well, I might defer to Mariah here, but it could be that you have a position that you used to have an uncertified person in, and that person happens to have a certificate now, or vice versa.
There can be reclassifications. I will say, if I can, just for a minute on the classified, when you talk about the decrease, we did have a change in a staffing model for classified support at the ELL level in secondary, and we bargained that last year with the Teachers Association to reduce the number of para hours and increase the cert time. And so we did see at the secondary level that classified hours for ELL did go down. So that speaks a little bit to,
Okay.
I think, what you have in 17-18 and what you're looking at for 18-19.
Okay,
I'd have to look at the district-wide support and who you have classified in that. I don't know what those
Yeah, I
cost
think-
centers are, sorry.
I think more importantly, maybe we'll get to it, but when we do discuss salaries, but I'd want to know, if there's a decrease in salaries, are we looking at classified, true classified, just classified, or we need to look at both certificated and classified for the salary in the central office? I'm assuming district-wide support means central office, yes? Yes.
yeah, that's,
Okay.
I think it's exclusively central office, actually.
Okay.
Is that
okay.
right?
Well-
Is there any FTE that are
Yeah,
not?
I
in
mean,
that?
it would be positions in this building as well as and support the schools.
So sometimes they're based here, but they are deployed out to schools. Right.
You know, Justin, those are all positions that would be classified district-wide support, or actually they'd be in, well, those two would be nutrition services, but I'm wondering if this difference between, on the certificated side, not thinking who that would be, but we do charge positions from the general fund over to the capital projects fund. I'm wondering if those, and it's about 3 positions, I'm wondering if that hasn't happened on the data poll yet. I don't know that.
I'll just be clear, the genesis of my question is really because we have had people who are doing administrative work who were previously educators, and they fall under the certificated umbrella, but they're really doing classified work, but they're not in the classified numbers, they're in the certificated numbers. And so that's always been a
I'm
concern.
going to defer to Mariah because I think it's based on the position. So if I was a teacher, but now I'm doing finance, I'm a classified employee.
Okay, but that's not how it was in this district a few years ago. We had somebody who was a band teacher, for example. He would be classified, he would be under certificated and non-classified. So I just want to make sure we're doing this accurately. I know in the past we haven't done it that way.
That's an example that you gave. There's another that would be helpful. You're saying a band teacher, for example, was listed under classified?
Well, there were examples given in the past, yes. I think HR, I don't know, there have been people under certificated and not classified.
So there is, so I'm an example of that. I'm a certificated person, but I'm in a classified job, right? So I am classified as a classified administrator. Even though I have a certificate, and there's one on file with OSPI, I'm a classified administrator. So we do it by position. That also has contract implications on who we provide contracts to under the RCW, who's protected under that RCW with certificated rights. But we work very diligently to ensure that people are labeled appropriately. Even if they have a certificate, if they're doing classified work, as the job description is classified work, they should be categorized that way.
When we look at salaries, using you as an example, would your salary be under classified or would it be under certificated?
We don't separate salaries for non-rep administrators by certificated and classified. Classified and certificated make the same amount. It depends on the job they're doing. So I don't make as a certificated.
No, I'm not saying what
Okay.
you
I
make,
think we're saying at the
Mariah.
cost center
Yeah.
level.
Oh,
Yeah.
cost.
Yeah, because that's always thrown off,
I see what you're saying on the
Yeah.
report out. I would have to defer to finance on how they report that out. I would not see that they would be separated that way.
Yeah.
We'll look
Would
into
it-
that.
Would it be possible?
Okay, it's a question to.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sarah,
I mean, I can
object
speak
code
to, you
conversation.
know,
We can easily pull data by the object code.
Yeah.
And so it really comes down to Mariah's point, it's really based off of the position. So it's really just a matter of just pulling data based off of that criteria.
It's just, we haven't been given information by the object code, we've been given information by certificated or classified, and it's inaccurate, and if that's the case, that's not the right information.
Excuse me. Okay. So I think we were kind of in between slides here. So any questions about classified before I move to certificated? Okay. On the certificated side, the numbers come down a little bit, but you have, again, you have offsetting things happening. So on the basic ed side, you have a reduction of 91 FTE. This is budgeted to budget per your question, Ross. So this is, I think I actually have May actual, but budgeted to budget is down about 46. But you have offsetting things going on. So on the basic ed side, on the far left, you show about 91 FTE reduction. And then on some of the categorical side, you show inclusive ed up by 26 and lab up by 21. And then there's some smaller increases kind of sprinkled throughout, but those from a number standpoint were the largest. Okay, so the story is overall down, but some programs up So you've got offsetting increases and decreases to get to that number. Okay?
There's
Okay.
a driver question, like what's driving the increase in inclusive education and lab, specific programs, specific enrollment, projected enrollment, whatever it is.
Well, that might be a conversation that more than one of us participate in. I mean, I can say, first of all, that inclusive ed and lab are receiving robust increases in their funding, and they are use it or lose it pots in that sense, that, right? So those programs have decisions to make in terms of how to utilize that. In some cases, we've been already using levy funds, and we're just merely supplanting that.
Sure.
But I'll defer to Israel if he wants to say anything about
Yeah.
inclusive ed here.
Well, simply that FTE increases throughout the year, depending on as IEPs, the referrals, and then new IEPs, so new students added to the program. The same thing is true for ELL. We get students that come in, and so that would be an example of adding additional student FTEs, so then staffing would increase.
This is about mix of students we're talking about for these specific programs.
I think an important thing to mention too with the lab funds, last year with the high impact lab dollars, we did not allow schools to hire. And so this year, we have given them that option, and we reduced, as you probably know, the certificated support staff, which was funded out of basic. And so many of our principals just started using their high impact lab dollars too. So they're hiring certs, but it's just not coming out of basic. So you see basic go down quite a bit, 91 FTE, but you see that lab go up.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which is what we want to continue to do.
Yeah.
They said before, leverage those dollars that we're supposed to for the needs of our students that we need to.
Okay. So I've got a couple of slides on the non-salary part of the budget, the extremely wonky term MSOC, which is maintenance, supplies, and operating costs. First slide is an overview. Second slide, I give you a data table that we can see some of the details, but here's, I think, some of the high-level takeaways. So what you will see in this budget is a year-to-year increase in MSOC that's pretty sizable. But when you actually look at it compared to 15-16, it's only a 2% increase. So think about kind of like a horseshoe here, where the district was here at one point, then in this, situation where, you ended 6 million, close to 6 million in the whole 1 year, a downturn of restricted expenditures in MSOCs because you have more latitude to be able to control those expenditures, right? And then a returning back to that level. So there's your horseshoe, right? So when I show you the data here, I want you to keep in mind that year to year, it's a big increase. Across the whole range of that horseshoe, if you will, it's only a 2% increase. Important thing to keep in mind as we see the data here.
Well, that's kind of what, and then we'll get into the details. It might shake out different between categories, but we're effectively going back up to the 15-16 levels with a moderate increase. Actually, 2.1% probably doesn't cover inflation since then, but so
Yes.
less than that.
Yes, I think that's about right. It's not, but I think a key point to make here, and again, something that a lot of people could speak to, is that it wasn't a peanut butter uniformly applied rate.
Right.
Each individual community worked really hard on their budget and got pushed back a little bit and then pushed back, and it was a deliberative thing. And so some communities are up considerably and some aren't, but it's all by design.
Yep.
Okay. So the second story is that you'll remember, before my time, but one of the strategies I think in this year and I think the year before was a mid-year kind of reservation of certain budget capacity in MSOC to make sure that the district was following its budget recovery efforts. So let's say if a budget was $10,000, maybe $3,000 might have been held back to make sure that the district landed in the best place it could. So a lot of what you see here is the restoration of what was in the budget, but was not allowed to be spent in that way.
Yep.
That makes sense? Okay, so that's what I mean by restoration of those contingency reserves. And then another thing you'll see on the next slide is both MSOC for central offices and MSOC for schools. The schools formula is a little hard to conceptualize because they also could conceivably be in a situation where they have access to more money yet next year, but it's a function of their carry forward. And we don't know what the carry forward is yet because the year hasn't closed yet, but we kind of know generally. So their year-to-year number is pretty flat.
Yeah.
But you got to keep in mind that they're also bringing carry forward from the prior year and may actually experience, their actual experience next year may allow them to spend more money, if that makes sense, okay? That's an important context to see when you just see a flat line for their budget. Did that make sense? Do you understand what I'm
I
saying?
was saying, if they spend their carry forward, meaning they would not have a carry forward going into the
Correct.
1920 and beyond that.
But
It
admittedly,
was
we
kind
made
of
it very difficult
Yeah.
for schools to spend that money this year because we're in the situation
Yep.
we're in. We might be in a different situation next year to some extent,
Mhm.
okay? Okay, so here's the data table. It's a little hard to read on the screen, but you have copies, right? So, a couple of factors I'll pull out for you. Okay. All right, so the all-in amount is $63 million, okay? That reflects a proposal of $51 million for the communities. You see that about midway down the page in the yellow column, okay? See that 51077, okay? Now, first question will be, well, what's that increase year to year? That increase is 21%. Seems again, like, whoa, that's a really big, but again, in the context of what we just talked about, the horseshoe, it's more just a returning to where that budget was 3 years ago, all right? We pulled out, or I asked to be pulled out, the grants and categoricals MSOC because it's a little bit of a different story, because as those allocations go up, their MSOCs go up almost by necessity, or we'll hand back the money,
Yeah.
right? So you see a 28% increase there, but we're pleased that we do, right? Because otherwise you'd be handing that money back, okay? So it's important to kind of see that money a little differently than you might see just the general ed money. Does that make sense? Okay. And then you see the schools, okay, which is a relatively small part of the MSOP budget overall. You see it pretty much flat. I mean, that fluctuates by enrollment, and there's a little bit of noise in that number, but it's essentially a flat number. But again, I said, you see that little line of carry forward. We don't know exactly what their carry forward experience will be next year, but it could be in the $2 million range, which is more than the actual budget, right? Now that varies by school. Some schools may have more carry forward than others, but to the extent that the district makes decisions to allow schools to utilize that carry forward, this year's rules and restrictions were very, austerity was the rule this year for all the reasons we know. But eventually the carry forward's there to be accessed, right? So all in, as I believe I mentioned on the previous slide, at $61 million is 61.1 is the all-in number for everything other than the schools, and that represents over a 20% increase for the communities in the central office, but only a 2% increase when you see it across the years of this budget recovery cycle. And I wanted you to have that important context. Otherwise, it just looks like this huge increase. Okay, any questions about that? Now, we also have a list of kind of and Lisa has volunteered to walk us through this if we want, like the top 10 of kind of the drivers, like what are the things,
That was my question.
Okay. And they're listed conceptually on the right of your slide.
Okay, yeah.
Curriculum adoption is a big one, and perhaps my boss may wish to speak to that a bit.
So there's not a lot of, I didn't come prepared to give you the exact details of some of that, but we've talked about textbook adoptions and some curriculum updates. Science is a big one. Next generation science standards. There's some big pieces and heavy lifts within science as far as curriculum goes. There's some math things at secondary that we've put off for the past 2 years as a district. And so as we move forward and think about this budget and the development, the district has to consider it's not really an if, it's a when. So how long are we going to continue to hold out on those expenditures? Because at some point they are going to also then be inflated by the curriculum adoptions that need to happen in the years when we decide to kind of turn those lights back on and make those expenditures. So every year we're holding that off. We're also holding off and adding them to the pile of other curriculum adoptions and materials that need to happen. So it's something to consider of how long we want to continue to put those off, because they're just adding to, and it becomes an aggregation rather than, or a summation, rather than a trade-off.
Also, one of the oddities in the teaching and learning community line is that we don't necessarily think of this as MSOC, but the Running Start kids show up as a contract for us.
Yes.
So we're projecting, I mean, that the growth of Running Start's been geometric. And as the projections year to year have gotten more and more aggressive, and they're still low, So part of when you see growth in the T&L line, that's part of it, is anticipating that those contracts will be larger, just simply because you have more kids going into that program. Any other, I'd say about maintenance and security.
They may want a little more detail.
Well, see, one thing is, like, transportation, and this is just me, where does that fall within these?
Operations and
Academic support.
Lisa, can you take that one?
Sure. So the level of detail that I have, which we don't necessarily want to go into tonight, is I have, the same comparative budgets similar to that for every single cost center. So, and Ben had asked me to point out just a few of the ones that are really significant, other than, up, down, up, down. And so those are the ones that I've listed off to the right there. So they're maintenance, security, and athletics, which all fall under is oversight.
School operations, academic support.
So those are areas that in the process of our budget reductions last year or this current year, their provision of their services was really impacted. And so they, for example, the area of maintenance, there were things probably that normally would have been done that they were not able to do this year. So we know what that looks like. You don't do it this year, then you're going to have to do it. The project's going to get only bigger if the more you put off. So we're seeing a little bit of catch up in that area. Athletics was kind of similar to that. Dave wasn't able to do a lot of things that normally he had in the past, again, because of budget reductions. And also I think, is, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're starting to take a little bit of the pressure off of the school's ASBs and bring it back centrally as much as we can. So that would be another reason why there's an increase in the athletics budget. In the area of transportation, operating costs are always going to continue to increase, fuel and whatnot, just the general increase of operations. And then our homeless transportation, that's a biggie. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. And so that's one of the larger increases.
So I wanted to, and this is just a reference point, I wanted to know, like, what are we budgeting versus this year, and then what is this year's actual versus last year, specifically for that? Because we can't, refute those costs. Those are costs that are just going up.
So
I want to know kind of how much are we budgeting for from an increase standpoint.
Homeless transportation. So our current year budget, $1 million. Through May, we spent almost $1.2 million. So granted, the school year is just about over, but this is through May, so another month and a half of bills. So you can see over budget. So our fiscal year, next year's budget for homeless is, we've set that at almost $1.6 million to cover, anticipated increases. Let me see here. Transportation, our operations of buses, our budget for that was, if you can believe, $78,000. Currently through May, we've spent $185,000. We have budgeted for next year $724,000. Now, so that is a significant increase, and I would have to go back to my detailed notes from Justin to see exactly what makes that up. But again, it's just bringing his budget up to a more reasonable and necessary level. Special ed, which I haven't got to yet, but special ed for our payments for out of district. Yeah. We budgeted less than $1.2 million. Through May, we're at almost $2.6 million, and so we're budgeting $2.8 million. So let me go back to this list. So inclusive ed, just an increase in services overall, generally are increasing, and in particular our our service to our services to out-of-district students, okay, continues to increase.
So this would include the contractual
Yes.
services.
Uh-huh.
And this includes transportation, or is that included in the transportation piece?
That is on the special ed side.
So transportation, so
Transportation.
like, for example, so when you talk about athletics, was that include athletic transportation as well? in
The athletics
that?
has their own transportation.
So everybody has their own separate
Sort of,
transportation?
yeah,
Okay,
right.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Teaching and learning, Dr. Harmon touched on this a little bit, just, again, eventually we're going to have to address our curriculum needs, so textbook adoption, increases in specific areas of instruction. Science was one that you're gonna see a significant increase. Math, let's see. So science, this year's budget was 18,000, less than 20,000. We've spent a little over that through May, 23,000, but our next year's budget for science is 108. So there are things that they are specifically needing to do in science.
It's the next generation standards.
Yeah, and math is another, area, so if you want to look at math
Sure.
probably in terms of textbook adoption.
So math, this year's budget, 87,000, spent through May, 61, almost 62,000, and we're increasing that, not too much actually, 73,000, so.
It's probably cost center 0320.
0320, okay.
Textbooks,
Okay,
that might be
textbook
where it shows
adoption in
up,
general,
probably.
yeah,
Yep,
yeah,
that's probably what I'm
exactly,
looking at
there
it
it
now,
is.
and I was like, that's
There
probably
it
where it
is. Okay, textbook
Sorry.
adoption, that was one line last year that was significantly reduced. Our budget, actually, let me go back on this one too, budget of 16-17, 2.5 million. Budget in this current year, 17-18, less than $1 million, 983,000. We have spent through May 926, so they're keeping it within their budget. But now for this upcoming budget, we are back up to even less than 16-17 at 2.1 million, a little over. So again, just kind of bringing back up to
What is
levels.
that for, Lisa, the 2.1? I'm
Textbook
writing numbers here.
Yeah, okay, so that's
Textbooks.
textbook adoption.
I can tell you exactly. So one of the large ones is that there's a statewide initiative about the K2 health and wellness requirements. And so that's one of the things, that's about $200,000 is what's in the budget, looking at that. The textbooks for math, the math adoption is about $500,000, grades 3 through 5. That's been put off for about a year and a half. The next generation science kit upgrades, it's nominal. It's overall about $200,000 is what the science piece looks like. There's some pieces in here about instrument purchases, music. That total is about $100,000. Some textbook licenses and things for ELA, K3. And then some expansions in secondary math, AP. Spanish adoptions, French adoptions, secondary schools. Dual language, 4th through 6th grade. Visual arts, I'm sorry, the dual language piece?
Yes.
It's small, it's 30,000. Small in comparison to some of the other expenses, it's not small, but, and then some other things are kind of passed through, even though it's MSOC, they get delivered to schools for dollars. So schools through curriculum instruction also receive dollars for equipment and instrument rentals, purchases and maintenance. That gets paid out of central admin MSOC, so they get passed through dollars for that. So it's really an interesting misnomer that it's central admin support because those dollars get pushed into buildings. Same thing for some of the elementary school workbooks that they use. We purchase those and they go out, or we fund their purchase of those. And then the other one of those that happens kind of similarly are the visual arts and performance art pieces, so they get funding. We fund a lot of some of the buses for those concerts and things are supplemented through central admin, as well as some of the art supplies and things. Rather than purchasing the supplies for them, they get the dollars sent from central admin for those things. So that's, all of that lives in that kind of textbooks and supplies, 3020, or 320, 0320. That's where that lives. So that's all of those pieces that, so when people talk about expansion of those things, that's what lives there, and that's kind of like what we've, so it's going back to where are we gonna invest, what do we cut, and how do we make those decisions of.
I have a question I'm trying to quantify, because I don't know if we can get the answer. The answer I'm trying to get to is what is the risk of delaying it? And it's sort of like if you're buying something this year that you could have bought 2 years ago, does it cost you any more? That's a direct, it cost me X number of more for whatever reason. Or, if we don't have new curriculum, what is the thing that we're missing? Basically, what's the risk of putting this off? And how do we quantify that? I know that the answer is, or how to approach the answer, but
I'm
that's
just making a note of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But it is
That's good.
it's a valid question, given our current conditions. So as we are moving forward in the right direction, I think it's also important to discuss the definition, operational definition of terms. You've heard textbook. And so when we say textbook, we do have adoptions that support open educational resources, digital resources that support our one-to-one initiative. And so the term instructional resources is probably more appropriate, but we're using textbook. When we hear that term, know that there are hard copy textbooks, which of course is the greatest business to be in these days, because you can change one word and create a new edition the next year. The reality is we also have resources that are digital, as well as.
So that's one of the things that we've looked at as we move into, there's a debate about one-to-one, but one of the other, I think unintended but benefits of that is that we can reduce consumables. So a lot of the textbook spent in the 900,000 even this year has been on consumables. So elementary schools are still using workbooks. And what does that look like when we transition some of that cost into, well, we've invested in devices. What do electronic licenses look like and access in that way? And so, no, we don't want to overburden students with screen time, but how do we balance that with some other investments we've made so that they don't have a laptop and a textbook or several textbooks and workbooks? And so providing that balance and shift to digital license rather than printing consumables, which are a recurring cost, kind of more so than a textbook, because every year you have to build that in as a maintenance level. But yes, there are some options as we think about rolling out one-to-one.
So can I ask, in terms of approving those are, those subscriptions in particular, are they going through also the instruction materials?
Yes, so, and there's a schedule for textbook adoption that is, so the pieces that are put forth here in the proposal are all part of what was on the schedule for textbook adoption, or resource adoption is what I'll call it then, resource adoption. Okay. And following that timeline, there were certain numbers of those that were supposed to come on every year. And so we are about 1.5 years to 2 years behind on that. So that's how they were chosen, to say, okay, well, what are we out of compliance with? Or for example, some of them we may have to do because we are out of copyright compliance. So the cost of a lawsuit, if the vendor were to find out, could be more expensive than either going in a different direction or finding out what we need to do to make that commitment. And so trying to make some of those decisions of weighing what is the real risk of this over that, or delaying this. So yes, but we can talk about the committee, and we can even think about sharing that list of where we are in that process is something that can be done. I can make a note of that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, yeah, please.
So let me just point out just a few more that are, and the rest are not as significant, but do impact the, when you're looking at the why of the increase. So, I'll point out Running Start, even though Running Start's revenue expenditure neutral because what goes out we're reimbursed for, but the significant increase, it contributes to our increased budget. Yeah. So, just to keep it in context, 16-17, our budget was just over $6 million. We actually reduced that in our current year budget to 5.8. We've spent so far through May 4.3, but we will definitely reach our budget, and we budgeted next year for 7.2, and that's all based on our increased enrollment projections, which again, we get the revenue back, so but it increases our overall expenditure budget. And then in the area of inclusive ed, again, just for context, as far to realize how much this program continues to grow, 16-17, just in general special ed support, 3.4 million in fiscal year 17. Then we go to 4 million. We're already over that budget for this year, almost 4.4. Our budget for next year will be 5.7. Now, here's an interesting one, out of district services. Back in 16-17, it was 250,000. Our budget this year is $1 million, almost 1.8. We've already spent 2.5 million. Next year's budget is 2.8. So again, the growth of our inclusive ed program is just really requires a lot of resources.
And that also shows up in the teaching and learning line.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm not seeing is that if inclusive education, the increased services is going up, but we've also lost staffing. So where does that factor in these numbers? Because I'm not seeing good comparison, because there's a decrease somewhere else. But there's an increase here. So-
Comparing increase in services but a reduction in staffing?
Yes.
Staffing at what level, Maya?
Ah.
Give me a little bit more.
Inclusive education staffing.
Like at
We've
the
had a
admin
lot of-
center or at school-based or?
Well, we've had a number of people leave, and in both. And so we are now going into contracted services, I saw. There's several more contracts that I saw coming through. So, I guess, I just feel like when we're comparing and we're saying that there's decrease and increases, we're not really looking at the big picture.
So our school-based special ed staffing is certificated is driven by the contract. And so that has not decreased. I think we do have some staff leaving at the admin center, but that we are filling those positions. So those positions are not going away. They do need to be filled. I think there's
Okay.
continuous
wasn't
need for
Yeah.
looking. Yeah.
Yeah, that was part of the question.
Okay.
is-
I just want to make
so
sure I'm
we are
answering
filling
your
that,
question.
But out of the buildings, though, we are going into more contracted services, it looks like. So we've lost a lot of paras.
So we have had to bring on some agency staff.
Yeah.
Now, when you bring on an agency staff, you don't have the certificated employee on, you're not using your basic ed, or you're not using your regular staffing. So that offsets it a bit, cost-wise, although agency does cost us more
Yeah,
than our
costs more.
employees, as we
So
know.
it'd just be good to see that
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah,
comparison.
lots of nuances to that.
I think it's important to note, as I shared before in meetings, that most districts have contracted services. There's not a district that has enough teachers to serve our sped students. So I think the question you're asking, Maya, is a good one, is that, so how are we doing in that area? And I said, I think that's a fair question in that. But to the staffing that's been reduced at the building level, we have contract language that says you're gonna have this amount of support, take SC or IP or those different programs. But I think specifically the out-of-district piece, we always are trying to hire teachers for those agency staff throughout the full year. We never stop interviewing or looking for staff.
I have a question, because it looks to me like, and maybe I'm missing, so it looks to me like actually staffing's increasing for inclusive ed.
You're back on the.
Budgeted staff.
Budgeted staffing, so that means, so that's what I'm saying, so we're not decreasing, I'm just position-wise, right? So I'm just curious about, is that my?
So what was the guess? If we increase
Number of students.
certificated, if we increase staffing, that's just we should decrease contractual services because we don't need them to
Exactly.
replace these. So
Right.
that's what we're saying. What, do we see that? And I think what we're looking for is like, is there an overall inclusive education
Yeah.
cost object?
Yeah. yeah.
Right.
in the
Because
street
we're
right
seeing
now?
portions of it here and portions over there, so we're not seeing the big picture.
Okay, so I just wasn't
So
seeing
if we
the
increase
I wasn't
staff,
seeing the decrease in
Are we
staffing that you were.
decreasing services, but at a district, obviously, is
People
a
have
different level of services?
I know they've left, but that doesn't mean the positions won't be refilled.
Well, that's
So
why
that's what I'm,
she's-
so that's what I'm saying.
she's
So we haven't
clarifying.
decreased positions, we've actually increased positions, right? So that's what I'm, because that falls in line with the, the more spending. It seems like we're actually increasing positions to accommodate the need.
People might have left the position.
Positions are there, we just have to fill them.
Yeah.
So we're not decreasing staffing positions.
But it affects our budget, so.
It does impact our budget, you're right.
Right,
Because
okay.
we are allocating resources, and that's what's budgeted. We can't always find the actual
Exactly,
people.
right,
And so
exactly.
we've had to, you're right.
Absolutely.
Agency hires, which do cost us more
Right.
than employees.
Okay, okay. But it's not taken out of the budget, though? Okay. And then I did have a question back. So it's interesting that I see that ELL staffing is lower when I doubt that number is going to go down.
Yeah, every year we increase the staffing, however we project at a certain staff. We have to keep in mind that we're actually exiting kids each year, and so we always have to get a percentage. We go with the percentage that we actually exit each year.
Yeah.
And then we increase, usually in our kindergarten, we have 500 to 600 students that qualify yearly. So we usually get back what we exit.
And then some.
Yeah.
Right, okay, that's what I was thinking, but again, the positions are decreasing.
Right.
So
The positive thing about that is we did receive increase in our state bilingual instructional program grant.
Okay.
So that's a good thing. It helps us with the bottom line with what we're spending in basic ed.
Okay. That was a robust discussion. That was great. Any other questions about this slide? Okay. So this is a required, there's apparently some regulation somewhere where every administration has to show their school board this slide. So you are now being shown this slide in accordance with that requirement. This is a report of how much money we receive in MSOC relative to how much we spend in MSOC, and an illustration of the fact that we spend more than we receive in programs 1, 31, 34, and 97. So we, I would argue, continue to be underfunded as it relates to MSOC requirements for basic ed. But this slide is here mostly for posterity because we can go back and show that you were in fact shown this slide in accordance with the law. But the other thing I wanted to note about this is the last time we met, we had a conversation about enrichment and how we're going to have to, in 18-19, this is the first year of the enrichment budget, so that local levies may only be used for, remember that, enrichment, and what does enrichment mean, and kind of the operating definition of enrichment right now at the state level is if the state doesn't fund something in their prototypical schools model, and you do, by definition now, it is enrichment, which long conversation about that. But this kind of illustrates that on an MSOC level, at least for these programs, that these are expenditures in that for MSOCs that are not directly funded by the prototypical model.
Ben, so the clarification, so that's funded in which year though? Let's say we didn't fund several things last year, but we did 2 years ago.
Right.
So how is that definition?
So what this is showing is in any given year, the state, we'll just walk through it. So the state is based on our preliminary enrollment projections, estimating that they're going to give us $33.4 million next year. Okay? We are budgeting that we will spend $38.5 million next year. Each year, this picture looks a little different, and then when we get actuals, it looks different. But that, I think to your question, the bottom will change every year depending upon what we decide to put off or what is being taken on in a given year. This number would have looked maybe a little less last year, probably less the year before that would have been a little more. But it is a snapshot of a year in time. Does that help to answer your question?
I'm just trying to understand how, when these numbers, when you came up with these numbers.
Yes. It's okay.
How do we determine, that's not something that would have been funded under, how did we determine it's enrichment? Meaning, if it was something that was not enrichment last year.
Yes.
And then we creatively came up with a program this year. is it just fall under enrichment, under our definition?
Okay, so I think it's a little simpler than that. Let me just take a step back, okay?
Okay.
Because I might have overcomplicated it. Really, this is, before we make any detailed decisions about how we're gonna spend money in the district, this is just simply budgeted for next year. How much they say we're gonna get, how much we're gonna fund. Or how much we're, excuse me.
How much
So I'm gonna confuse it even more.
That's okay.
How much we're gonna get from the
Okay.
state,
Mhm.
what we say we're gonna spend.
Mm.
At a raw level, the
Okay.
difference between those two.
Okay.
And the state has certain assumptions about how they get to that $33 million number in terms of how much is needed for these types of students and these types of schools. There's all sorts of intricate detail, I know, because I developed it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't, when it comes to us, it doesn't matter anymore. That's for allocation purposes only.
Okay.
You say you're gonna get $33.4 million, and we represent to them what we are projecting to spend in those same programs.
Okay.
And if it's more than that, then we can say
We have to justify.
about
that.
$5.2 million of this falls under the state's current definition of enrichment, not at any real detailed level, but just in aggregate, that you're
Okay.
not funding these things, and we've determined that they're
That
needed
these
and
are
can.
important and.
Yep,
that-
exactly.
That's considered an.
Exactly,
enrichment
yep.
From our definition. Okay.
And in terms of the depth of your question, it remains to be seen how detailed OSPI will probe into, like, so you said this,
Okay.
it's not, they're still figuring that out themselves. I'm kind of interested to see where that goes, but did I get it the second time? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay, so, I know that's not all the information you want about the general fund, and we still have salary pending information to get to you, but we also need to talk about the 4 other funds, which are part of your budget adoption. They are the Capital Projects Fund, the Transportation Vehicle Fund, the Debt Service Fund, and the Associated Student Body Fund. Some of them are very, very straightforward. Some of them have a little bit of texture to them. Okay, starting with the Capital Projects Fund. So the list of projects that you are familiar with has not changed in any material way in this budget. We are basically continuing with the issues that were authorized in the 2016 bond? And we have another sale coming up here in the fall, and I've been working with the gentleman from ESD 111, I think is his ESD, who's our financial advisor in this, to kind of work through how that will work. So that's a big part of this. We passed our tech levy by like 4 votes or some very, very small number. So the tech levy is part of the capital projects fund, so it will continue to be part of the revenue source of this fund. And so the intent here is, there are some issues on the funding side of this, but on the spending side, you've seen that project list, and it's just continuing to implement those projects in the manner and the timeline that they've been represented to you. Okay? Okay. At this point, I want to give a little update about the capital facilities plan, because it's relevant here in terms of, you've probably heard some discussions about impact fees in the community, both in Kent and in the surrounding areas. Kent City Council, I think, just recently adopted a cap on impact fees. We were not the impetus for that cap, but there's a couple of neighboring districts that have impact fees far in excess of ours. But we are obligated to advise you of that every year. This year's plan is just a annual refresh of the data that, there's no new projects in it. It's just an annual refresh of our enrollment projections, inflation, these sorts of things. And we put in the Kent Reporter, I think last week, a 14-day comment period for the plan. There's not, because nothing's really materially changed other than inflationary adjustments, I don't imagine that it's going to generate. But the upshot is that the impact fees, which you see there in the bottom right, are recommended to be adjusted by the Seattle CPI. which as I understand it is what Kent has done for quite some time now. It did it last year. And so CPI was 3.1% last year. So it's tentatively on your agenda for June 27th. We are not impacted by the cap that was adopted, but Federal Way and some other districts are. I'm still kind of learning, there's huge variances in the size of these impact fees, and it's a really interesting, it's not an area I've really been involved in before. But I think what I would say is we're really not the show on this one. There's a lot of other districts that are really pushing the envelope here. We're just essentially asking for inflation. Okay? Okay. The next one is the debt service fund. There is a little bit going on here. There's 2 slides. The first one has this graph on it, and then the second one has the last 3 budgeted years. So part of what I've tried to do is understand when the bond was passed, kind of the long-term plan for debt service on these bonds that we sell, and implement some best practices. One of the best practices is you don't want to have your tax rate bopping up and down. You want to try to maintain constancy in your tax rate, and that requires some planning in terms of when you sell bonds, how long you structure the debt for. So it's just like a home loan. Do you want a 15-year mortgage? Do you want a 30-year mortgage? Do you want a 5-year ARM? All these things have impacts on what the size of your payment is going to be and how long you'll be paying and how much interest you'll pay. And so like all of your peer districts, we're trying to structure each one of these issues so that the rate doesn't go up and down, and citizens are left to wonder what's, why, at least as it relates to what we control, right? We don't control the state rates and everything. And so part of what you see here on the next slide is a sizable increase in the projected revenue in 18-19. That number might change a bit. I have a conference call with my advisor next week, but it's going to be sizable. And the reason for that is because A, trying to manage the constancy of the tax rate, B, trying to manage the district's bond rating situation. So again, if you're a homeowner and maybe you're going through a stretch where your credit is not as good as it once was, you might opt for shorter term credit because you pay less of an interest rate, right? So that's true for a school district as well. And so he is helping us think through the strategies of how to raise the same amount of money that was authorized under the 16 bond in a way that mitigates the impact of bond ratings and therefore mitigates fees or interest that we would pay. And he's very good. He knows exactly what he's doing. So he has recommended this plan to us and has volunteered to come and speak to the board if that were to be necessary. But you would be kind of in line with your peer districts in this approach of, as each issue comes up, structuring it in such a way that the line stays constant over time. So, any questions about that, or at some point, I'd like for Mark to be able to dialogue with the board on this, because it is an important thing. The Associated Student Body budget. I have my Associated Student Body expert on staff here with me today to answer all questions you may have as it relates to the ASB budget. Sarah, do you want to hit some of the highlights we talked about?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So thank you for your time. So as you can see, what we have done here is between actual of 16-17 and budgeted of 18-19, we really have taken a really close look at the amount of contingency for both revenue and expenditures. And so really what that means is, for our schools, we really tap into different types of fundraising activities the ASBs would like to do, and this goes all the way to the elementary level. So it's really making sure that the schools have support and they really get some expanded information about fundraisers that are available to them. For example, a couple of our elementary schools this year actually have tapped into a booster-thon, which really is a fun run, and it really brings in another organization and the school actually, as well as with the PTO, they really kind of work together and they can really raise a substantial amount of money for our elementary schools. And this isn't just that, this is kind of all over the district, really. So it allows different, schools with different poverty levels, just kind of some additional funds. And as you may or may not know, ASB funds, though, are very targeted for obviously extracurricular, cultural, before and after school programs. So it really kind of expands what the student body at those schools want to do. And I'm sorry if I just kind of rambled on. I'm feeling very passionate about the ASB. And then, of course, with those expenditures, obviously can tie to those fundraisers as well. But really, the difference really is making sure that when we put in our contingency for the ASB, we are allowing a cushion for all of the great ideas that our ASBs are coming up with, but really that kind of align with keeping our beginning and ending fund balance kind of in check. Because at the end of the day, students are raising money for this year's class and this year's student body, but not for a class 10 years down the road. So we want to kind of also make sure that students are really kind of tapping into all that hard work that they're raising money for. So.
Oh, thank you. Good. Yeah, that's, so as Sarah was sharing with me, there's a little bit of a history on the ASB in terms of the size of the fund balance being pretty big at one point. So this is, this seems modest, but I think it's considerably smaller than it was at one point. And fun fact, I receive more emails and calls about the ASB budget than I do about the general fund, even though it is 1% of.
Yeah.
Close to home.
If people are passionate about it, and as well they should be.
Oh, part of it is also, there's questions about what that covers versus the levy.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's been explained.
Yes. Yes. Well, at least, as I'm learning, the state accounting manual is pretty clear about what it's for. It's fairly specific and direct about it, and we try to adhere to that. There's some gray area, but we certainly get some pushback on it, in terms of what's like fundamentally required to participate in an activity versus what's kind of an enhancement or, but we are cognizant of and adhere to and talk about a fair amount. What is the responsibility of ASB, and what should it be, and how can we defend a standard and keep it bright?
And Ben, from a capacity building standpoint, what you just mentioned to question, based on the questions that you're receiving in general, those common themes, where do we see the need to build capacity, particularly within our school leaders? And Sarah, you may have some insights as well.
We've been part of some pretty animated meetings with the school. What's the title? What's their title?
The ASB bookkeepers.
Yes.
So I think really the schools and obviously the secondary ASB bookkeepers, they have a lot of vested time and energy in making sure the student bodies of all of our secondary schools really have all the tools necessary to support their student councils. And so really it kind of comes down to, from them, what will be the reliance on ASB? I think, as Lisa pointed out, with just a much tighter general fund budget, Dave Lutz with athletics just was not able to provide all of the transportation needs for some of our athletic events. And so Dave actually had to ask the ASBs to actually fund some of that. And so as Lisa mentioned, you know, that increase, that slight, and it's a very small increase in the athletics budget, is to hopefully take that pressure off the ASBs. So again, the students can really make sure they use their monies, you know, across the board for their clubs, for their class activities. And so, if that's what you're hoping for. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I just realized I don't have a transportation vehicle fund slide. Where did that one go? I'm missing a slide. I will get you that slide. It is probably the least issue-heavy budget, but I don't have it for some reason.
Do you want me to speak to it a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so transportation vehicle, again, probably the, I'll say maybe the simplest budget. You know, very typical, standard. The only purpose for this fund is for the purchase of buses. Justin is planning on purchasing 6, I believe, with the resources that he has available. The one thing that I would point out that looks a little different next year in this budget than previous years, he was awarded a state grant for the purposes of, let's see, taking his old buses down, because I guess there's a certain, you have to meet a certain standards in order to get rid of a bus. It's like a hard drive. You have to destroy the hard drive, basically. And so this grant will allow him to do that, and then in turn sell or dispose of those buses, generating income to buy another bus. So long story short, his plans are to purchase either 5 or 6 buses, and then with the addition of that little state grant, it's only $140,000, but that will allow him to do the work that he needs to, you know, transition the buses. Other than that, it looks pretty standard. This fund does receive state, the depreciation reimbursement funding from the state, so.
On a positive note, he's also working, and just looked at, just across the school district, is selling some buses. Oftentimes districts will do that, so he's actually checking them out. We may be able to get 10, 12 buses to replace part of our fleet that's getting older, so things like that really help.
Do we know if the new buses are natural gas buses, or are they diesel, or are we?
Do you know that?
Good question.
I asked a couple of times ago, and I think they were not going to go
I'm
more.
thinking-
CNG,
Overhead
so
cost.
I didn't know if they were.
You're moving away from that?
Well, I wouldn't say moving away, but based on the information, knowing that the costs are generally higher and the return on the investment is not as robust as we would like, but we certainly I don't know the numbers right now. But we can certainly get that information to you.
So I will insert that TVF slide into the version that we emailed to you. But it's not a lot going on in that budget this year. Okay, so at this point, we have some slides for you for where we project to land at the end of this year. Some of which we already went over because we went over the enrollment, where we landed with enrollment. We were within 30. So I'm just going to take you through 3 or 4 of those critical slides, and then show you where I think we're going to land, and then talk just briefly about the interfund loan, which I hope will be the last interfund loan in the history of the Kent School District. In fact, we should stamp it that when we put this will be.
Declare it.
Okay, so what you have here, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my screen. So you have the revenue slide, the expenditure slide, and the fund balance slide. So I'll start with the revenues, okay? So we're projecting $344.9 million in 12-month revenue. All right, that's a May-to-May change of 4.4%. All right, now match that with a projected expenditure of $338.2. All right, which is ever so slightly lower than last year's expenditure level May to May. All right, I'll put those two numbers together, 344.9 and 333.8. And right now, we're projecting a $1.1 million fund balance at the end of the year. There are still things moving around. It is the end of the year, but there are still variables. People leaving the district, cash outs, vacation cash outs is a big deal this time of year. And this is an extraordinary year for comings and goings in that regard, so that's difficult to predict. It's going to be very tight. It's going to be very tight. This is not a big buffer for a district of this size. Lisa, did you want to, well, I'll say, do you have any questions about it first?
Do we, back in the local revenue was under year to date. Do we know some of the drivers around that?
Well, the good news is, so that was property tax collections for the month of April that came in a bit lower than my projection. May came in a bit higher. So I almost saw that rebound, so yeah. And my projections for the rest of the year are essentially expecting similar levels to last year, which would be typical. So assuming nothing goes sideways with our collections, I think we're back on track with our tax collections. Other revenues are very in line with our projections. So there isn't anything out of the ordinary. We have, with some staffing adjustments, all appropriate, that is enabling us to claim some, I don't want to say new federal revenue, but additional revenue for the remaining months of the year based on having moved those expenditures from basic ed to the federal programs. So Kathy's reimbursement claim actually for the month of June will reflect some of that, and then similar with July and August. So my projections do include that projection for slightly higher or slightly more federal revenues than what we had projected earlier in the year. Yeah. So that's incorporated in here. My concerns might be, waiting to see payroll for this, typically for the month of July, because that's typically one of our higher months with cash outs and timesheets and things like that. So we kind of have in our mind what that number should be, but it could be a bit higher just based on people leaving, that we weren't really aware of, things like that. So once I get through July and see my July payroll number, then it just gets more and more firm from here forward.
What about August? Do we see, I know there are people leaving are we computing far in advance, people leaving?
Well, anytime an employee leaves, we're faced with a cash out of some sort, but typically that would happen, many times we're talking about certificate staff or teachers, so that typically would take effect in July, just based on contracts. But employees leaving could happen any month. Yeah. So it's kind of, those that we know, we've incorporated, those that we don't know, there can always be unknowns.
And so there's no way to, based on, from what I read, the number of people who have left, it's not extraordinarily higher this year than in the past. But you're talking about cash out that you can't predict, you're saying.
And not everyone qualifies for cash out. So the other thing that's offsetting vacation cash out is also vacancy savings. So someone leaves, they cash out, and dependent on when we refill that position and begin compensating the employee that's coming in, it can offset that somewhat, although not necessarily the entire amount. Most certificated staff will leave by July 1 because they have to sign a contract that starts July 1 for the upcoming year. We do have some that ask to be released from their contract, but most certificated staff, that's when we tend to see most.
Excuse me.
Questions?
Okay. So, final thing as it relates to that is that, so just the way the funding cycles work, June and July are cash poor months. And so we knew we would need an extension of the interfund loan for June and July, regardless of where we were, frankly. So I think the 27th, is it the 27th? So another thing on, preliminarily on your draft agenda for the 27th is a renewal of that interfund loan. The way it will read is up to 15 million, but we do not expect that we will take the full 15 million. We may not even take the full 10, but it preserves our option. And we definitely need it for June and July, or July and, yeah. And then next year, it starts to become kind of a math problem in terms of, so our apportionment payments are going way up. How many months of those increased, because it's a cash issue, right? So we're, you know, I'm not prepared to say that on this specific day next year, but if we manage this correctly, we should probably never have another interfund loan. I mean, it's just, this should be it, particularly with what's happening. But it is necessary for this summer, and I didn't want you to be surprised by it on your next agenda. And that was always part of the, that's not a recent decision.
Mhm.
That would have had to have been the case from the very beginning, given just the cash situation and stuff.
And we've paid off our other
Yes.
months?
Yes, so we paid back the loan at the end of April, and we paid about $150,000 of interest. Basically, what we do is we make the capital projects fund whole for what they would have otherwise earned in interest out of the King County, whatever the rate was, so it was
Right.
$155,000 or something, so we repaid the loan, we repaid that interest, and now you'll be retaking out that loan. And as I said, it will be written at this higher level, but the actual cash, the actual amount we take out may be considerably less than what we asked for. But we think it's wise to not get too cute and just renew the loan we have.
I just want to make sure that everyone who's here, first of all, thank you. We know that this is a labor of love and labor intensive, and I want to pay extra homage to our Budget and Finance Office and staff for the work that we've done thus far, what we've attempted to do, and we see evidence of this, is really reshaping our structural budgeting process so that we can be more predictive in our work, and we're not surprised at the end of our fiscal year. And so thank you for that, and if there are no further questions, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Yes.
Do we need a break?
Where are you from? No. Good. Okay.
Here's these marathon meetings now, right? Okay, absolutely. So I'm going to pass out two pieces for us to start with.
This we could think
On page.
Pass these this way.
We got it.
Okay.
Yeah, we
No,
got these.
they didn't get that one.
Oh, is that a different one?
Yeah.
Two documents, one's
Oh, that
stapled and
one.
one's not.
Yeah, no, so we got this, yeah, they got this.
Oh, yeah, we got the big one.
Okay.
Oh, you didn't?
Not the big
The
one.
one I
Yeah.
just stole one.
And the schedule.
Yeah, I was just saying.
So I want to set the big picture for what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. We've been looking at our compensation studies and knowing that we needed to do them for quite some time here at the Central Admin Center. And so we've divided that work into two major components. One is the one that we did this year for non-represented administrators, which I'm going to share with you tonight, the IT staff, which I'm going to be sharing with you very soon, but before September 1, because that's when their next contract year starts. And then the principals and assistant principals. We bargain with them, so I can certainly share with you the compensation study. I think I did share with you in a closed session at one time the results of that, and I have shared that with KPA as well. And we're in the midst of bargaining with them. The second piece that will happen in 18-19, which is next year, is we will be looking at the non-rep prof tech salary schedule and also the non-rep group. It is a miscellaneous group that includes everyone from security to LPNs to a variety of people. There are about 50 job positions on that list. And so they are in the non-administrator group, so they will be next year. And so the big question is why and how many? I think that's always an important question to ask. How many people are we actually talking about in this salary schedule? We're talking approximately 40 individuals. Some are certificated, some are classified. They are all administrators, which means that they serve in capacities of either supervisor, assistant director, coordinator, director, executive director, and then our chief or assistant superintendent. We no longer have the school improvement officer position, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Another piece I wanted to give you just so you have context, because sometimes when you're looking at where we're going, you want to go, where are we? So that's what this document is right here. This is our current 17-18 compensation schedule for this group of people. So everything I refer to will be coming from this to something new, okay? So I just wanted you to, so as you're looking at the new schedule, thinking, okay, but what currently exists, thought it might be helpful for you. So where I'd like to start is with the why, and then I'll walk through the timeline, the process that we use, the total cost savings, and next steps. And the why is important. The last time a compensation schedule our study was done for this group in particular, but it was done for a lot of other groups, was in June 2013. And if you were around, and I think there are two people who are around who've seen this blue book before, it's a classification study. And it was completed by Dr. Dick Stedry, our Chief Business Officer, and then Tuan Nguyen also completed that with him. The fringe benefits were not included in the classification study completed in 2013. And that's important because we are going to take a deep look at that tonight. And it really should be part of the total compensation package that we consider. So we wanted to make sure we included that when we did that work this year. After the salaries for this group were set on July 1st, 2013, the non-represented administrator group, and I'm giving you a little historical perspective here, continued to receive compensation increases over the next 5 years. That's understandable. That happens in most organizations. And those resulted from state pass-through allocations, COLA, if you will, and then also what we're going to refer to as Me Too. Now, sometimes Me Too can have a negative connotation. It's often used in organizations to ensure that everyone's moving forward. However, there were times when Me Too is just lumped in, and we were not looking at necessarily where that current salary was for comparative districts. And so what I provided for you below is the percentage increases in the salary by year for the non-represented administrators. So in the middle column, you see the total percentage increase. But on the right, you see how much of that was COLA. I've heard that several times. People want to know, well, which one's which. So if you're adding it up, 10% of the 16.9 was COLA, and 6.9 was non-COLA. And that happened during bargaining years, sometimes with the KPA bargaining, sometimes with the KEA bargaining. Those increases were added. So the fringe benefits for the non-represented administrator group also continued to increase as represented administrators, our principals and our APs, bargained for increases. And so that included noticeably on-call days. That was not a fringe benefit. That was previously part of this group's fringe benefits. Other benefits, such as increases to the doctorate stipend, you may remember when that happened in 2015, that went from $3,000 to $5,000, and then the implementation of a $2,000 superintendent credential was also added. And it was added, this is interesting, it was added to this group first, and then the principals and assistant principals had it added to their contract. So that's an interesting little piece about what happened with fringe benefits. So as we thought about the compensation study, we thought about what is our purpose first, and then what is the scope of the work. We knew we needed to engage in a comprehensive compensation study to compare salaries and benefits, similar to other positions and function groups in area school districts, to determine three things. Were we comparable? Were we competitive? And were we within market? And so we knew we were competitive. I heard quite often people said, I am so sick of hearing about Kent's administrator salaries. I heard that from my colleagues, my HR colleagues. And so I knew we were competitive, I just wasn't sure how much, and knew we needed to do a compensation study for that purpose. We needed to ensure that the positions were compensated over market, that we could build a more sustainable yet competitive compensation package, because we could slice them really low, but then we lose our competitive edge. And so then we moved into the fact that we knew that school-based leaders, and we wanted to think about our leadership pipeline, would want to move into district leadership staff. So we needed to consider the fact of putting that principal AP salary schedule next to the administrator salary schedule and make sure there was room for growth and development in salary schedule. And then also district leaders. If you're a director, is there room for you to grow into being an executive director assistant superintendent? And then finally, our biggest parameter really was we had to complete all of this work by July 1st before the next contract year. So what was our process? So I'm going to focus first on the fringe benefit analysis, and then I'm going to move over to the salary schedule. Again, both of them being part of the total compensation package. We did the fringe benefit analysis in-house. Scott Nicholson led that work for us, and we started that work in the fall of 2017. Now, he looked at our current offerings, the current benefits, and I've listed those for you under 2A I1, and it lists all the different ones we've looked at. I've also included them in some exhibits, and I'll share that with you in a minute. He only reviewed KSD benefits, not benefits that may be offered in other districts. And that's an important point to think about, because when we looked at other districts, we only said, do they also do TSC matching? Do they also do EDL cash out? Other districts may offer benefits that we didn't offer. For most KSD fringe benefits, he was able to identify the actual annual cost for the benefits offered. This is important. He didn't look at the maximum liability. He looked at what we actually spent for those 40 individuals. He also needed to clarify the impact of some things that we were offering on other known benefits. Let me give you an example. When we began offering 6 flex days, in addition to 4 on-call days, in addition to 25 vacation days, and then we still had a vacation cash out of 10 days, what we found is people had lots of vacation days to sell back, as you can imagine. And so offering days, although we couldn't necessarily quantify what that meant as far as a cost, we knew it was driving up our vacation cash out days. Does that make sense? So he then compared these same benefits with 5 other school districts. We compared to Spokane, Tacoma, Lake Washington, Seattle, and Vancouver. And you know Washington well, those are our largest school districts. We know with administrators, the ability to commute, the willingness to relocate is higher with this group of people. And so I've included his findings, and that is Exhibit A. It looks like this. And this is the back of your packet. And a couple of things I just want to highlight. You will see in this exhibit the actual fringe benefits for the NRA group, which is non-represented administrators. You will also see on the second page for the non-represented employees. Remember, we're doing that compensation study next year, so this will be important information for us, which we'll need to update. He also made some recommendations at the back. A couple of things I just wanted to highlight in this is the difference between actual per diem and adjusted per diem. And this is an interesting concept, and if you look at the second page of his piece, you will see that districts are mixed on who offers adjusted per diem for cash out and who doesn't. You also see which districts do vacation cash out, or they do EDL cash out. And one of the things I thought would be important for you to know is the difference between actual and adjusted. Anybody know which one's higher? Pop quiz. Adjusted is actually higher. And the way you get to it is actual per diem is a 260-day contract divided by 260 days. Makes sense, right? That's your actual per diem rate. So if you made $100,000, your actual per diem rate would be $384. But if it's adjusted per diem, you take the 260-day salary and you divide it by 222 days. You subtract out the holidays because you can't work those days anyway, right? Well, what does that do to your per diem? It brings it up to $450. We have been paying vacation cash out at the higher rate, at the adjusted per diem. That is a 14 to 15% increase in cost. So those are just some of the things that you're going to see as we talk about fringe benefit analysis and what we looked at doing for the upcoming year. But I thought it was important to go ahead and explain that now because it's a little bit confusing and wanted you to know which one was higher. So once we reviewed the results that Scott shared with us in December and January, we made some initial recommendations for reduction in benefits. And it's important to know when this happened. We began to look at it, as I said, in December and January, and then in February 15th to be exact, we did the RIFs for central administration. When we shared the information with staff on the 16th, with the central admin team up here, we went ahead and shared that there would be a fringe benefit reduction. We wanted to go ahead and make sure they knew that. We also shared with them we were doing a compensation study, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. That's important that you know that they had that, that knowledge. We then reviewed the entire compensation package once the salary compensation study was done, and we did that in the spring. And so now we have a finalized. So if you look at Exhibit B, in the back of your, looks like this, and it has Exhibit B at the bottom. This is what we settled on for fringe benefit reductions. Now we did a 2-year plan. Because remember, we have a 2-year process. We have it this year and next year for this compensation study. But we also knew that to do too much in 1 year was going to be very problematic for staff. And so you're going to see a couple of things. No superintendent credential stipend for administrators hired beginning July 1st, 2018. But then that is completely eliminated in 1920. The doctoral stipend for anyone coming on board goes to $3,000, but then anyone that has a doctoral stipend beginning in 1920 will be at $3,000. You walk all the way through it, some of the major changes. Commitment stipend, we're only paying half of what we paid before to those individuals who were with us the year before. No one who's joining us now will get a commitment stipend that would be paid out in 1920 anyway. So that's been eliminated for the 1920. Days we kept very similar, so vacation days, still 25. Interesting, flex days reduced from 6 to 3, and on-call days we eliminated. So the impact is people, if they want to take time, will take vacation time, the 25 days, the 13 holidays, the 3 EDL days. And then when you look at vacation cash out, we reduced it from 10 to 5. The number of days that are available for cash out. And notice we're not using adjusted per diem anymore, we're now using actual per diem. Most people did not even realize that was a huge benefit to them. I mean, I'm still explaining it, but they go, I guess that's bad for me, right? And I go, it's good for us. But yes. The separation vacation cash out we also reduced from 40 to 40 from 50. Again, paying it at the regular rate. You heard Lisa talk about the vacation cash out and how that's costing us a lot of money. It absolutely is. And the other piece about the annual vacation cash out is they still have to use 10 days of vacation days to even be able to cash out. You can't just continue to bank vacation days. And then we will be reviewing professional dues where they have been paid without a lot of criteria, thinking through, do we really need to have this many memberships as part of a professional organization? So that's a gist of a rundown, if you will, of the fringe benefits and where we landed. That's just one component. We'll get to cost savings of all of this in a few minutes, but I wanted to make sure I shared with you what that benefit analysis looked like in that process.
Can I ask a question? And so the previous 2013 study, did it go anywhere into some of this analysis, like the per diem? I mean, did
I haven't read
it?
every single page of it, but I did not see anything about fringe benefits or adjusted per diem. And this was completed, I joined July 2013. I remember this is one of the first books sitting on my desk when I walked in. And so I was very curious as well as to how we did this process. My experience, my former district, is you consult out for compensation studies. Very seldom do you see it completely done in-house. There's a variety of reasons for that. We'll talk about a little bit about that because we actually did hire a consultant for our compensation study here. And there are a couple of reasons we did that. So if you go to page 3, on November 28th, we hired a compensation consultant. His name is Lee Gohe. I consulted with many of my CHRO partners in K-12 and said, who have you used? Who has been successful? And his name came up over and over and over again. So I met with him, and he agreed. We paid a total of $11,750 in consultation fees. And remember, that is for all 3 groups, IT, principals and assistant principals, and this administrator group. And he also helped us with salary schedule work. He not only did a compensation study and a comparative study, he actually helped us do the work to build a new salary schedule. His survey and analysis has been provided on Exhibit C, and it looks like this. I'm not going to walk all the way through this. If you love this kind of stuff, you'll enjoy it. It'll be great bedtime reading or morning reading. There's all kinds of great information. He walks all the way through his analysis, which I find very helpful. And I think a strong compensation document stands on its own. You should be able to read it and understand how you came to the conclusions you did. Nothing against previous documents, but I find that this is going to be very helpful for anyone who wants to see this, and it should be public document. People should be able to see this. So we used this compensation study, and he provided that to us, and we shared it with executive cabinet, and then we began to work with Lee on a compensation suggested schedule, and he engaged with this in this work during April. And I'm bringing all these dates up because I want to make sure we all know what was happening at this time. There's the RIF going on. We're still trying to keep our admin center updated. They know there's a fringe benefit reduction, but we also say we're still looking at compensation. So everyone wants to know what the final thing's going to look like. We're working towards May and June. We will get there. So Exhibit D, which looks like this, was the second document he provided for us. And this one is solely focused on executive management compensation suggested schedule. And he gave us some really great ideas, and one of them I'm going to really focus on, and that was the idea of indexing your salaries. And so I'll talk a little bit about that once we get into the actual the salary schedule. Once we reviewed these results, we shared them with executive cabinet, and then we brought, as I mentioned before, the fringe benefits back in and said, okay, let's look at the whole picture. Here's the salary. Here's the fringe benefits, total package, because that's what people are thinking about when they decide, do I want to stay? Do I want to stay invested here? Do I want to come? Do I want to be, for recruitment purposes? So we wanted to make sure we looked at the whole thing. The final salary schedule that we developed is Exhibit E, and I'm going to walk you through how we got to this in a few minutes when we get to the cost savings. But this is what you will see on June 27th for board approval. You will see, and if you want to compare it to what you currently have, and I pass the current one out, you can put them side by side, and you get a bit of a sense of how some things changed. You will see that the supervisor 1 column is completely gone. The great thing about a compensation study and looking at every single person is we actually did not have a single person placed on the supervisor 1 line item, so we didn't need it, so we eliminated it. Supervisor 2, we looked at those responsibilities, and then we have assistant director, coordinator, director, executive director. We've eliminated the school improvement officer line item, and then we have the assistant superintendent chief officer. You'll see the difference in $3,000 for doctoral degree. That's going down starting in 1819. You will see that the superintendent credential has been removed. And you will see instead of all administrative contracts are based on 260 days, all administrative salaries. And this speaks a little bit to your point earlier, Maya. Not every single administrator gets a contract. The only administrators that get contracts are those doing certificated work. So I do not get a contract, although I'm a certificated employee. And that's an important nuance that we wanted to make sure was reflected in the salary schedule. Now, salaries are not different based on whether or not you have a certificate or not. You need to be in the job. If your job requires a certificate, you have to have one as part of the job requirements. So that was what the salary schedule looked like as we finished. I'll talk about how the savings actually come into play next. So as we go into cost savings, let's go back to that document, Exhibit B, and I'm going to walk through with you just a little bit where the savings exist. You're also going to have it on Exhibit F. Looks like this. Yeah, I think second to last. So for the 18-19 school year, when we're talking about fringe benefits, there's an approximate 53% reduction in fringe benefit costs, which totals $212,928 before payroll taxes. If you want to add payroll taxes, it's another $80,912 to get you to $293,840. 53% is right around $323. We have some added savings that we believe should be calculated in that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what we can actually calculate, and your document there does it for you, is the elimination of 5 days of cash out at the regular per diem rate, not at the adjusted per diem rate. The $3,000, and this is just for 18-19, so we haven't eliminated it yet, for new administrators, and then eliminating the superintendent credential for new administrators. We do have a few administrators, one administrator actually next year who has a superintendent credential, and after 18-19 and 19-20, we'll see an additional $2,000 in savings. Savings of reducing commitment stipend by 50% for current employees only is $73,800. That will increase or double the next year. And then the savings of eliminating the EDL cash out has been provided there for you. So the other added savings that are difficult to calculate but are very, very important for us to consider is what I shared with you. That reducing the flex days from 6 to 3 and then reducing on-call days from 4 to 0 requires people, when they take time off, to use those vacation days, the EDL days, and that reduces the number of vacation days for cash out availability. We spend, at this point, approximately $200,000 a year on vacation cash out. And that's just people who are here cashing out their days, not the ones separating. So it's a big expense. So to reduce it on 2 levels, 10 to 5, and then reduce, forcing them to actually use their vacation so they have less days to use for vacation cash out is going to help rein in that cost. And then, of course, the separation, vacation cash out, not using the adjusted per diem and going from 50 to 40 is a cost savings. Cost savings continue into 1920. I've already talked about the doctoral stipend, the superintendent credential, and then elimination of the commitment stipend. Talked about the flex days. We can go to page 4. Then we get into the savings that happen with the salary schedule. So the new schedule that I shared with you, there's a couple of key things I wanted to make sure I shared. The last page, just in case you're wondering, is our current employees and where they're placed on the new salary schedule. So the number one question our non-represented administrators wanted to know, and they asked me several times, will my salary go down next year? And it was very important that if we move into a new salary schedule that we recognize people need to stay frozen at the salary that they have. So placement of all non-represented administrators is now on 3 levels, as I shared with you, and not 6. Some had 6, some had 1 or 2, if you look at this current year and this year. You're also going to see that each level now represents 3 years of level-like experience, with level 1 being 1 to 3 years, level 2 being 4 to 6, and level 3 being 7+ years. In the former, they were moving up every 2 years. So the rate of how quickly they moved up that salary schedule was much, much quicker. Salaries were set from the assistant chief's salary at 100%. This is the idea we got from Lee, and it really made sense, even when we looked at the comparatives on every single one of these types of jobs. He said if you'll start your assistant superintendent being the 100%, we did a comparative, looked very closely at what all other assistant superintendents were making, and we set our levels 1, 2, and 3 based on that. And then you back everything up. So executive director is always 90% of the assistant superintendent salary. Director is 80, assistant director is 70, and supervisor is 65%. What that does is it keeps an even amount between them. It gives room for growth. So if someone wants to go from a director to an executive director, there's room for them to grow. The other thing this salary schedule did, and if you get your calculator out, and Ross, I'm wondering if you noticed this, the percentage differences between the columns was not consistent. Sometimes it was 4, sometimes you went up 3%, sometimes you only went up 2%. This is a consistent 2.5% between level 1, level 2, and level 3, all the way across. And then this way, it's consistent. So it's consistent horizontally and vertically, which was really important to us so that if you're growing in years of experience, you see a steady growth. And if you're moving up the pay salary scale, you're also seeing consistent growth. Shared with you where we set those assistant superintendents, level 1 comparable to the average comparative functional group mean salary, which is the average. Then the mean and max, we did a mean and max average, and that's how we came up with level 2. And then level 3 is the comparative district functional group max salary. So I will take our chief officers as an example. If you take a look, and I'll even point out my salary there, 182,668. I'm above level 3 at this point, which means that I will be one of the many employees who will freeze on the salary schedule until the salary schedule catches up. As we think about savings, it's important for you to know that we also, within this number that's represented here, included 2% to account for the 50% reduction of the commitment stipend. That's less actual cash that an administrator was getting. And we also knew that our area districts were looking at a 3.1% cap. Within 1 year, we could be priced out and we could be at the bottom of the group. So we built a cushion of 2%. In future years, so that we don't do this me too, so KEA bargains or principals bargain, and we go, oh, well, they got a 5% or 3% or a 2%, and we're just going to give that to the administrators. We've done something different here. What we're saying is, annually, we will review the assistant superintendent salaries. I'm on number 6 on page 4. We will review the assistant superintendent salaries at the comparative districts to determine if IPD should be applied to the non-represented administrative salary. All other salaries will continue to be indexed on that salary level as described above. This procedure will ensure that Me Too provisions are not automatically applied. So we will look at the market value of those positions, look to see whether or not the IPT should be applied, and if it does warrant it, then go ahead and do it. But we do it based on the job, not because somebody else got it and we all think we should get it. And that's a big correction from the way things have been done over the last 4 to 5 years. To ensure that we're not negatively impacted, I shared this a little bit already, any administrator currently compensated at a higher rate than what is designated on the schedule or has received a job offer letter will stay. With the exception of the fringe benefits, everyone's moving to the reduced fringe benefits. And then if an administrator is currently compensated at a lower rate, we will move them onto the salary schedule. That's what this document did for you. And if you look at the bottom, we're calculating a savings of $14,000 after we do that. That doesn't seem like a lot of money, but what we're doing is we're building a sustainable model moving forward. And as administrators continue to leave and people are placed on the salary schedule where they should be, we'll continue to see those savings come in. So the next steps, the full compensation package I just shared with you will be shared with current non-represented administrators at a meeting tomorrow. They have not seen this. We felt that since we were doing this in a board work session where the public could be here, they should also be able to have this information, and we want to give this to them. But we will tell them clearly this is subject to board approval with the salary schedule coming before you on June 27th. We will also be sharing it with finance. So for budgeting purposes, Ben already alluded that they have been waiting on some compensation information. This is just some of that information. The other is probably some bargaining pieces that we are continuing to work through. And an overview of the full compensation will be sent to all current and newly hired administrators on June 22nd, reminding them of board approval. You all take action on June 27th, and then all compensation assignments for non-represented administrators will reflect these changes on July 1, subject to board approval. And then we will be updating all non-represented board procedures to reflect the changes to the non-represented. So there's lots of language in there about commitment stipends and vacation adjusted per diem, and we need to clean all of that up as we move forward in the summer. So I said a lot and talked a lot about a lot of things. I'm sure you have some questions. Thank you for letting me get through the process and the timeline and the outcomes, and happy to provide any clarity.
Thank you.
Questions? I need to really look through this.
It's yours to look through.
Yes.
I'm not taking it back up.
But I do appreciate that we got away from the previous, because I came in December 2013, and that was the biggest concern I had. Everybody and the staff here talked about this, how unfair it was, wasn't discussed with staff. So I really appreciate this being an open meeting and process. People would clearly understand, even if they don't understand the technical language, at least we're being transparent about it. And the decisions we've made were based on information that was presented to us from that study. And where there are flaws in how that was determined, I appreciate that we're going back and fixing them and not just shoving it under the rug. And I do feel that some of the questions about stipends and it was really, I don't know, I feel like I need to say this, even if it may not be appropriate. But these were things that were imposed on, not imposed, but it was predetermined. And I think staff had to work with what they had at the time. And it was a concern that board members brought up, and I'm really happy to see that it's being corrected. So I just want to be clear in saying that you've had to work through difficult circumstances that were not determined by your own practices, so appreciate that.
Continue to work through that.
One of the steps in working in this direction of ensuring that you have the information is to give it to you a week before it comes before you, so that you have time to read it, and if you're going to vote for it, you know what you're looking at, and you have an understanding, and you have, okay, how did we get here? So that was why we wanted to make sure you saw it tonight. I appreciate allowing us to add this to tonight. I know it made tonight a little bit longer, but I think it's valuable for people to have that opportunity to sit through it, because we have lived and breathed this for about 5 to 6 months, and so, you know, we're kind of entrenched in it, but this is a fresh look for you, and recognize you need some time to process that.
This is hypothetical then. If we have questions or disagreements with either underlying fundamentals or the end result, how do we provide that feedback in advance of the meeting next week? Or is it the meeting next week that is the next action?
I think it's important for us to get as much information. Our purpose was to share information with you in as timely a manner as possible, so you can process, draw conclusions, and ask any questions you may have. I would say we'd follow the same process. If you have a question, you can direct it to me. I will make sure staff that question, and then we will circle back with you, our responses. Again, we want to give you enough time to process well before decisions need to be made.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Any other?
Thank you. The only document that, although it's public record, anyone can see anyone's salary, and there is no distinguishing personnel information on here. If anything, this is public. If anyone were to go to Kitsap Sun, you would see this. So I don't have an issue with you having this particular document. Everything else is just our thought process, how we worked through it, and comparison of salaries. So there is not any HR personnel information that's confidential here. I am asking that I have the opportunity to share it with our administrators tomorrow, so that they can have a similar, we're going to put them in tables and we're going to walk through it together, very much like we did here, so that they can see how it was all put together. It's really important that people understand that.
Or I would just ask the same thing. So there's also information here about our IT staff and others that aren't having that conversation tomorrow. So as we think about sharing.
You're
this
thinking
and
about
how we
the actual
inform-
salary schedule.
Right, so
This,
there's
this
more-
document right here does include a lot of information that IT has not had an opportunity to see yet. So that's important. I will not be sharing this entire document tomorrow.
No, we won't, but it will be out. So giving our employees a chance to kind of consume that before we, is all I just want to.
Thank you.
Okay,
Share. Right, we don't want the world to tell them.
Very good.
right. Thank you so much. Thank
you. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Lisa and Sarah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and there are no more questions, we're adjourned.